Hi, I'm Rachel Beck. Welcome to Elite Literary Book Group, and I'm going to start Thomas Hardy today, which is my favorite author, and my favorite book, Jude the Obscure. Oh, I don't have it here. Where did it go? Anyways, this is a very tragic novel that is a Victorian novel, and it wasn't received well in its day, just like many other novels I've talked about. That later on is deemed as an absolute masterpiece. Most of the time when you're reading British literature, when you're not used to it, and you haven't grown to really appreciate it and like get lost in a scene that's just describing nature and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. That takes some time. It's hard to do when you're young. But the other thing about Thomas Hardy that's nice is that he's so controversial. He talks about, premarital sex and the dark night of the soul, questioning religion, what happens to someone when they're stuck in their social class. And these are very relatable things to us today. My students who actually take the pains of reading the book and really participate get so much out of it that, in fact, I actually hear from students later on who want to go back and reread it. And it's strange for teachers to hear that. It's like, what do you like Thomas Hardy? Gosh, like it was so hard to get through. But the harder a book is, sometimes the more rewarding it is when you're done, because you're going through this journey with these characters, and it doesn't end happily. But that truth, the thing that really offends people sometimes is just the truth. The truths that are revealed in that novel will change the way you think about everything. And that's what you want to do with education. I mean, you want to explore things that are challenging for you to think about. You don't want to just keep regurgitating things you already know. If the text is easy for you to analyze, it's time to move on to a different text and challenge yourself. So, like I said, it wasn't well received. This book was burned by the bishop because, not that it says anything really bad about religion, I don't think. It's just that it questions. And this was an appropriate time to question, because this is during the time when the Origins of Species came out, and everybody's reading it and talking about it. And there's also some other, besides Darwin's Origin of Species, there's other things and discoveries that are coming out that contradict the Bible. Okay, and I'm not going to turn you into an atheist, okay? So don't worry. But it's important because the only education that these people really had was from the church point of view. And the church at the time was corrupt. To go to college and to study basically anything for a profession, you had to study divinity. I mean, what other profession were you going to do besides maybe be a clergyman? So imagine you're in college and this is what you're studying, but you're also exploring all these other things that's contradicting, and you start to have some doubts. And Thomas Hardy certainly had a lot of doubts, but he was also really concerned with God and nature. Looking out at nature, and I bring this poem up so many times, but it's really well worth your time to look at, because it relates to this period of themes, and that's to look at Memoriam in Memoriam by Tennyson. And he just lost a friend, and he's soul searching, and he's looking out at nature, and he's thinking, if God is revealed through nature, then there must be something wrong, because in the way he describes it in red tooth and nail, I mean, if you look at just the viciousness of Mother Nature, does that really present a kind, protective God? No. He asked the question, that we're really special and unique, and we are. But he says, is nature so careful of its type? And nature says no, all must go. We could have a natural disaster, and depending where we're at and what the circumstances are, we could be wiped out very easily. And so, is it, indiscriminate, or is it random? Is there a purpose? Are we believing that there is a reason for everything that happens in our life? Or is it all just random? Now, I will tell you that Tennyson, at the end of the poem, stands up to reason, which reason has been the big problem, is because man's ability to reason, and is kind of just reasoning his way into a religion that seems more suitable for himself. But he stands up to reason, and he says, I have felt. And I think that's what the Romantics have really done in their reconciling nature and God, is to also validate our experiences and our humanness, our feelings, that they are valid too. Our experiences do matter. There is, proof and scientific theories and all this kind of other things going on. But then there's also a soul, the human soul. And so, anyhow, Thomas Hardy gets a reputation for being this raging atheist, but I don't really see that in his biography by Ralph Pite. He says that he had always kind of went back to that, wanting to hear that still small voice, which is an allusion to Isaiah. And that he still wanted to hang on to his church, kind of more traditional values than what was happening with the evangelical movement. And I will get into that too with the book, because I also see it as a struggle between an Orthodox and evangelical movement of religion, because Christianity especially, has not been exactly stable. It's evolving. And is the church supposed to evolve? Not according to the Bible. It's not supposed to be divided. So, these people they're scholars and they're intellectuals, and they have a tremendous amount of faith rooted in them. But it's not enough to keep them from having the dark night of the soul. And so I will talk about that later. Also want to talk about, just Victorian times, a very class-oriented structure here of people. And in short, Thomas Hardy said the book was a tragedy about a boy who couldn't go to Oxford. Now that might not sound very tragic, but I want you to think about whatever your high school job is or college job. I'm assuming you don't want to be there forever. If it's at a grocery store or a movie theater or whatever else you could think of. I mean, imagine if that's what your father did, and so that's what you are supposed to do. That's your destiny. You're going to stay in that position for the rest of your life. And let's say, I know that you're watching this, you're a very intelligent person, and probably also an artsy and creative person. And when you're stuck in a trade, and that's not even a trade that you really choose, it's sort of chosen for you, that's tragic. That's very tragic. Just think of the smartest person in school, which would be like the character of Jude, being told, you're just going to be a blacksmith for the rest of your life. You don't have an opportunity to go to college. And it's not that obviously Thomas Hardy had a good education, but he didn't get to go to Oxford. And he did struggle with, back then you had to, learn Greek and Latin. And he struggled, and people who were comparable to his intellect, he probably was smart, because I think Thomas Hardy was a genius. But he's watching these other people that he knows, his friends, go on to Cambridge or Oxford. And the only reason they got there and he didn't is because of their family background. And that's what it came down to. And that's what it comes down to for Jude. He's poor. He is the archetype of the Victorian character, the little orphan boy who's lost his parents and is living somewhere with a relative who doesn't want him. And he feels like the birds he gets in trouble for feeding in the beginning of the novel, he feels like they were living in a world that didn't want them. And no one wanted him too. And you see this also in the character of Pip in Great Expectations. And so I will read that once I open up with that passage. I want to read something that Thomas Hardy said. He called this a miserable accomplishment. It is definitely his best book, but because it was so controversial, and he had just people burning his book. One reader actually burned it and sent him the ashes, and someone else called it like Jude the Obscene. For Victorian times, it was obscene, and in some of his other books were too, but not to the extent where this just, it was okay as long as you didn't take God completely out of the picture. Okay, so he does that where, you know, but it's a true, honest realization sometimes when you think, where is God in all of this? And he doesn't show up. What happens when your prayers aren't answered and you begin to doubt? So at any rate, tragedy, which is my favorite thing to study, and the reason why, I mean, I'm kind of sick about it, but I guess because I could watch King Lear for fun. But I like it because I happen to like the truth. I like to look at the world as it is. I think that's better than trying to embellish it or color it or just pretend this didn't happen or just say fake news or something I don't want to see. I want to see it, you know, because I want to try to understand it and think about it. And this is the type of book that's really going to open up your intellect and make you question some of your beliefs. That doesn't mean if you question God or whatever that you're going to turn into an atheist. I've read it many times and I'm okay. If anything else, it makes you have to realize why it is that you do believe and explore that more. So anyhow, I want to say I want to quote Thomas Hardy. He said, "The zest for writing another novel." Now, I should preface this by saying that after Jude the Obscure, he stopped writing novels and turned to poetry. He'd already written poetry before, but now it was his main occupation, which is sad because I think there's only about 5 novels. And Jude was the last. So the zest for writing another novel is quenched by the knowledge, by printing a novel that attempts to deal honestly and artistically with the facts of life. One stands up to be abused by any scamp who thinks he can advance the sale of his paper by lying about one. So, you know, let's look at like Jane Austen, which I love her novels. And in a way, they're kind of similar because they're about ordinary people, and they're about the rural area and the town people and the lower class and the way that they behave. Because guess what? They're probably a lot more interesting. I mean, when you look at the comedic parts of any Shakespeare play, it's usually coming out of the lower class people, right? So Jane Austen, though, if you read her stories, they all end happily. This it's kind of like Cinderella's story. The poor girl from, you know, a poor family background ends up falling in love with someone who is wealthy and owns a lot of land, and then she ends up marrying him. Now, she never goes on past that, like what happens after the marriage. Hardy does that. He talks about what happens after the marriage. And when he was writing Jude the Obscure, he was in the midst of a very bad marriage. And it was disappointing to him and kind of made life more disappointing. If you've ever been in a bad, well, hopefully you haven't. Hopefully, I'm thinking you're probably too young for that. But one of the poems that he wrote about Emma, his wife, all I can remember is the last part, and it said, "Never were two souls wasted in their prime." And so if you think about if you get married young, which they weren't, they were like 29, which is, relatively older for people getting married. Not nowadays, but back then, certainly. This still though, the younger years, the 20s, you're not a teenager anymore, you're out of the house, you're done with adolescence. This should be a really good time in your life. And if you make a bad decision about who you marry, you've got like the next 10 years or however long it lasts. We know statistically probably only has about a 50% chance of lasting. That's going to be probably the prime of your lives together, and it's going to be wasted. And so that's what I mean though about being honest, and not having kind of this colored view of romance and possibilities, because how many possibilities did you have if you were a lower class person? You have to remember, this is before I've been talking about the American dream with American novels. The American dream is completely absent. There is no, like, well, I'll just work really hard and, get into this school and then I'll prove myself to everyone. The society kept you down. You were stuck. And that's really what Hardy is criticizing. And that's what made people offended in the Victorian era. Going back to his hometown, though, I like this quote. He, if you went back to Dorset is the community, but Dorsetshire is, I guess, where he lived. People that talked about Hardy, they said they could not see much point in writing books at all, but especially not ones as miserable as Hardy's. And he also goes on to say that they may have felt like Thomas Hardy was making fun of them in a way, because they don't show up in the best light in the novels. But that's what he was interested in. And like many other writers like Tolkien, Hardy was a very nostalgic person. And just in reading this, he's worried about the railroad cutting through. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, I can't even practically get out of my neighborhood because of all the construction. And it reminds me of a very Sad Willie song. So, all these bad things were happening. And on top of that, there's a freeway where we used to live. And so that's, when you see something like that, it's always, just think Industrial Revolution. And writers typically are against it because we want to keep things sacred as they are. And writers have a great deal of respect for nature. But obviously, we have to live and house all these people. So it is complicated. But one of the things that he did as maybe an assistant, and it's because his father did this too, he was an architect. And speaking of nostalgia, one of the things that I'm reading in this book, and if you're really, really interested, this is a great biography. He really takes you through the entire Victorian period and the works and the religious struggles and all those things that I'm going to point to. I'm pretty much getting from this. If you'd like to get it yourself, it's Ralph Pike, and it's The Guarded Life. Because Thomas Hardy was actually very shy and reserved, but he didn't mind pissing people off. It's kind of interesting. Anyhow, I'm losing my place. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about his work on churches, restoring churches, to the attempt to try to go back to the medieval characteristics. And I'm just going to read this part of the biography. It says, nearly all the work was connected with church restoration, the rebuilding of medieval parish churches of England according to the principles and habits of Victorian Gothic. In middle age and afterwards, Hardy looked back in horror at the destructiveness of the Victorian fashion for restoration, seeing only the harm it caused, the loss of memories, history, fellowships, fraternities, and the rupture of continuity brought about when old buildings were rebuilt insensitively and according to a standard model. I think that this really comes through the themes that are in Mayor of Casterbridge. And that was the first Thomas Hardy. That's really what got me hooked on Thomas Hardy. And it's another good one that I may end up doing, but it just doesn't have as much, as far as themes go, and I don't think quite the depth that Jude the Obscure has. But it is the struggle kind of between the old and the new. And the main character, Michael Henchard, who is definitely a tragic character, and that's one of the reasons why I like to teach it, because it works well with the tragic hero. But he's kind of old-fashioned. He does something stupid in the beginning, and then he ends up being mayor, and he works himself up by just sheer stubbornness, really. And his friend, who becomes his nemesis, Farfrae, comes in with more new ideas, industrializes farming, and he ends up taking Henchard's place as mayor. There's also a woman involved and all this other kind of stuff that happens. But the story sort of parallels with the Old Testament story of Saul and David. And at first, Saul just loved David. And I guess he kind of had these migraine headaches, and David would play, I think, the harp for him. I have to double check on that one. But at any rate, Farfrae was also kind of a musician, and people gravitated to him and his new style and new way of doing things. And so in the battle where David kills Goliath, people had kind of exaggerated his success and said, Saul killed thousands, but David killed tens of thousands. Small part. Pite writes, meanwhile, Farfrae prospers and Casterbridge modernizes. Clearly, the mayor of Casterbridge depicts a universal human situation, the clash between old and new, the Oedipal struggle between father and son. And so between what's happening to what's happening as far as the industrialization, which doesn't seem much, but it affected him, the restoration of churches, the evangelical movement, which there were some other people who wanted to go back to old church, the Roman church for them, Roman Catholic Church, and they were considered apologists, and this was the Oxford movement. And I think Hardy was just really conflicted, and you see that in the struggle that Jude has, as he wants to study divinity. He dreams about having a position in the church because that's really all he can imagine. And yet he is forced to kind of question his own faith. And part of the reason why he does that is because of his relationship with Sue Brighthead. And Sue Brighthead is one of my favorite characters. it's rare that at this time you would have such a strong, independent woman character. And this is another reason I liked Hardy, because, or I still do, because I feel like he really likes women. You don't get that feeling when you read Dickens, Charles Dickens. Um, but with Hardy, you do, because Sue outsmarts Jude. She outshines him in her intellect. She's more well read than he is. And she also comes from a poor background. But this is probably the character that made Victorians the most upset. And it probably had a lot to do with the fact that she was also a woman. And that wasn't proper. But she brings up some pretty good questions about the whole nature and God. And the question that I'm going to focus on is about a death scene. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on that because I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there will be a death scene. And in the question, it asks you to think about how that scene really demonstrates the novel as a whole. And so all the issues that I'm talking about in terms of social class and problems with marriage and religious struggle, all of that is really demonstrated by this one scene. And oftentimes in the AP test, even though none of the questions are going to be reoccurring, they usually point to a particular incident, or tell you to focus on a character or scene, scenery, or something kind of controversial or political, or some kind of social issue or something like that. But anyways, but the focus is not just to write about whatever they're asking you to write about. You want to make sure you address the prompt. But by doing that, you have to reveal the novel as a whole, which is why I'm going on about the introduction, and I will do one more before I start getting into the text. All right, see you next time. Thanks. Bye.